Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our UFC Fight Night Woodley versus Burns post-fight wrap-up. I'm Ariel Helwani. That is Gilbert Okamoto in Las Vegas, Nevada, site of tonight's event. It happened at the UFC APEX. No one, as far as fans, were in attendance. Bit of a different scene from the one that we saw for the first three events in this pandemic back in Jacksonville. We will get to that in a moment. But first, Brett, we have to talk about what happened in the main event. We'll talk about some of the big stories that came out of this event. And none bigger, of course, than what happened in the main event with Gilbert Burns defeating Tyron Woodley. It was a very dominant, it was a very one-sided performance. He won 50-45 on one judge's scorecard, 50-44 on the other two. No one disputed the fact that he won all 5 rounds. Maybe the first round could be a 10-8, but otherwise it was all Gilbert Burns from the jump. So let me ask you this. Bigger story coming out of this fight, how Gilbert looked or perhaps how Tyron looked and maybe didn't look, if you get what I'm saying?
No, for me, it's 100% how Gilbert looked. And I get the temptation to make this about. I think that Tyron's probably the bigger storyline coming in. He hadn't fought in a while. He had overcome. He's been battling some injuries really over the last few years. He lost every round in his title fight against Kamaru Usman. But it was sort of one of those situations where, like, hey, the guy's 38. He's coming off a long layoff, but he says he's still at the top, so let's prove it. He's fighting the younger guy. That was a storyline, right? And then he goes out and he looks the way he does, and he loses all 5 rounds. So I think just human nature, it tends to say, oh, Tyron looked terrible tonight. I did not think so. I thought Gilbert made Tyron look terrible. I think that there is probably some truth to, of course, that Tyron Woodley is past the peak of his career or the prime of his career. But in that first round, Tyron Woodley walked out. He looked like he was in phenomenal shape. Everything that he had talked about, in the weeks leading up to this. I know you had several conversations with him. He was saying all the right things. He knew what the stakes were in this fight. He talked a big game. If anything, he put a lot of pressure on himself by sort of, making fun of Leon Edwards and saying Colby Covington wouldn't fight him. And he really was talking himself up before this fight. And so he went out there in the first round. And what do we think of Tyron Woodley? We think of speed. We think of power in his right hand. Gilbert Burns out Woodley in this fight. When those two guys were throwing the right hand early on in that fight, when Tyron was fresh and 100% and throwing with all the hand speed that we've come to know Tyron Woodley as, Gilbert beat him to the punch. Gilbert was extremely confident as a lightweight, moving up to welterweight. I talked to some people before this fight, and they said, hey, Tyron Woodley's the better boxer, he's the better wrestler, and he's the bigger guy. Whereas Gilbert Burns' advantages in this fight, he looked bigger than Tyron Woodley in this fight. He out-grappled Tyron Woodley when he wanted to. He was more physical than Tyron Woodley in the clinch up against the fence. So I thought that to kind of dismiss or take away anything from Burns' performance would be a shame. I thought it was far more Gilbert than it was Tyron falling off of the ledge.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Phenomenal performance, the best performance of his career, at least in the UFC, in my opinion. This was a guy who had won 5 in a row going into tonight, 7 of 8 going into tonight, undefeated since moving back up to 170, has looked really good. Now has won 4 in a row since moving up to 170. And of course, he never fought someone like Tyron before, never fought in a UFC main event. You come up and you show up like that after you talk all that smack. You called out Tyron. It reminded me a lot of the situation when Tyron 6 or so years ago called out Carlos Condit, who was, the former guy, the king, the world's extreme cage fighting king, the UFC interim champion, all that stuff. And no one really gave him a shot. In this case, more people were giving Gilbert a shot going into this fight. But, the same sort of thing where it's like, all right, the up-and-comer takes the throne of the former champ, and now you've got a new player at 170. It reminded me a lot of that situation. Now, I didn't see this coming from Gilbert. Like, when he came to the UFC, he was a solid guy. We knew about the BJJ background, had a good run at 155, good run recently at 170. I didn't see this coming. I feel like he's a threat now. Like, he's a legit player at 170. Did you see this coming out of him?
No, I don't think anybody saw this coming. And that's not a knock on the guy. It's just that, he's obviously a very, very talented jiu-jitsu guy, but he doesn't have a ton of wrestling credentials, obviously. And then especially when he's moving up in weight, that's always that's kind of the question. How is the jiu-jitsu guy going to fare against bigger guys? Because how is he going to be able to take them down? And what's really spearheaded his run through this 170-pound division has been his striking. And I think you got to give Henry Hoof a ton of credit for that, man. I mean, you look at what's going on in that camp right now at welterweight. You look at what Henry Hoof has done with Vicente Luque, Gilbert Burns, and Kamaru Usman, who's from that same team. He deserves a lot of credit, man. I mean, Henry Hoof has an aggressive style. I did think going into this fight with Woodley, I was of the opinion that a lot of others were that if anybody did have a little bit of an edge on the feet, it was Woodley, just because of the one punch knockout power that he's had throughout his entire career, the hand speed, all of that. But one thing that I did think about this matchup going in is Henry Hoof's style, man, that aggressive forward style, and especially in a smaller cage tonight. I just think this was showing what you can do under Henry Hoof's striking system with a very talented guy, an athlete, and Gilbert Burns. That's what we're seeing. I mean, obviously this guy's a gifted athlete because of what he's accomplished in the grappling world. And now you're seeing that same work ethic and that same intelligence and the same athletic ability applied to the striking realm. And he's one of the most dangerous strikers in the division. And I can't believe I'm saying that, because we never would have said that a year ago.
Do you think the days of Woodley being a factor at 170 are now over? He's 38. Obviously, his last fight was 15 or so months ago, right? And he comes back and has a performance like this. Do you feel like he'll be a guy? He's a name still, right? But in terms of being a factor at 170, a player, a contender, those days are now over.
I mean, I don't think you stick a fork in it yet, right? I think it's a little premature to just say this guy can never make it, but he's right on the edge of that now. I think he's crossed into that zone of like, I don't expect him to reclaim a championship at this point now. I don't expect him to fight for a championship ever again. But would I be shocked if he did? No. But he's right on that line now, where if he loses one more, or if it takes him a while to come back from this, then yeah, I think, and there's nothing wrong with that, man. Like you said, the guy's 38 years old, and this is a very competitive division at welterweight. There's some tough guys in this division who have cardio for days. They hit hard. I mean, you get to Woodley's done a lot in his career, and to be at 38 and having the injuries that he's had, yeah, I don't expect him to be in the title picture again, but I wouldn't completely rule it out. Would you?
I mean, I still think he's a factor. It kind of reminds me of maybe like a Rafael dos Anjos at 155 after he lost the belt, and maybe
Right.
lost one or two after. Still a name that you have to respect, still a guy. But with Woodley, he's got a lot on his plate. He's got a lot of things that he wants to do. And I think his age surprises people. I think a lot of people don't consider him to be 38. He's almost the same age as George St. Pierre. He just came into the sport a little later and didn't take a lot of damage early on in his career. But the last two fights, 10 rounds, where they were fairly one-sided, it's going to, if he does have another run in him, and things have surprised us over the years in the sport where guys in their 40s have made runs, it's gonna be a long road. And especially when you consider the fact that over the years he had a contentious relationship with the UFC, so that comes into play as well. And to your point, 170, probably along with 155, the most stacked, as far as at the top for sure, division in the sport. You've got a ton of contenders. There's a log jam, guys waiting very patiently, some impatiently to get their shot. And that leads me to my next question. I love Bisping and DC, but come on, this talk that Gilbert Burns, number one contender, like somewhere in the UK, Leon Edwards must be pulling the very little amount of hair that he has on his head. Jorge Masvidal is in talks, and I know things have gone kind of sideways in that regard with that fight with Usman, but like, you can't leapfrog those two guys with Gilbert Burns, right?
You know, I wouldn't say that you can't, because I could see it happening. I could see a world in which it did happen, because as well as I do that the number one fight to make is Masvidal versus Usman, right?
Right.
That's the fight I want to see. I think that's the fight you want to see. It's the fight the fans want to see. It's the right fight. But if for whatever reason that fight doesn't come together, and you've got both sides pointing fingers at each other, and now you've got Masvidal talking about a potential rematch with Nate. Let's say for whatever reason that fight didn't happen. I mean, stranger things have happened than Gilbert Burns getting a title shot. And you look at some of the elements at play here. First off is just the travel. The situation of who can get where, and obviously it's easier for Gilbert Burns to get to Vegas to fight Kamaru Usman than it is for Leon Edwards right now. And you've got the storylines. Gilbert Burns and Kamaru Usman are teammates. Gilbert Burns is now coming off of this situation, which he has fought twice already in this pandemic, and he's looked very, very, very good in both cases. So sometimes you catch a little lightning in a bottle, and I think Gilbert Burns has that. Now, I still don't think he's going to get the title shot, but to say that he can't, I mean, I've seen the UFC make decisions, make stranger decisions than to put Gilbert Burns into a title shot right now against Kamaru Usman.
I guess what I'm saying is, if those reasons weren't factors right now in the travel one. I mean, yes, there is a scenario there where they can't come to terms with Masvidal and Edwards can't come into the country, and they need a title fight, right? Although Dana White has been saying that "quote unquote" Fight Island is going to be ready in July, so that doesn't seem like it would be an issue. But yes, if those two guys aren't available, then it comes down to Burns being the next man up. Although very interesting scenario that's going to have to play out, right? Who trains Gilbert Burns? Who trains Kamaru Usman? Where does Henry Hooft and the rest of the team fit in? Are they training at the same gym? This is going to be really interesting. Usman, I saw on Twitter, gave him props. Gilbert Burns respectfully said he wants title shot. This is going to be fast. We've never seen this before. We saw Dillashaw Garbrandt, former teammates. I don't think off the top of my head that we've seen two actual teammates fight for a belt before. This is Dana White's dream. This is what he was trying to get Fitch and Koscheck to do many years ago.
Yeah, yeah, especially two guys who are just on fire right now. I mean, we're talking about Leon Edwards and how good he's looked, and Burns is how good that he's looked. We kind of like leave the champ out of it. The champ has been Kamaru Usman has looked unbeatable, in his run. So, Usman was in Colorado the last time I talked to him. I think he's one of those guys who, he told me that he's trained with Mark Henry a little bit. He's trained in California a little bit. He is a guy who likes to get different looks. So maybe if there's a situation where they say, hey, we got to split this camp up somewhere, maybe one of these guys will make the decision easier and say, well, I'll just move my camp for something. We have seen something like that in the past. But yeah, this is another reason why I think that it's at least a possibility that we would have to entertain that, because you have this storyline playing out that these two are teammates. Fans love that. And if the UFC can't make the Masvidal Usman fight for whatever reason, then I think this becomes a real option.
All right. If they do Masvidal Usman, or if for some reason they do Masvidal Nate and then they do Edwards versus Usman because he's won 8 in a row, who would you match Gilbert up against?
Well, I think there's a chance we could see Gilbert versus Leon Edwards, right? I mean, if they're able to make Usman and Masvidal, then you can make Edwards Burns. But you're saying if Edwards were to get the shot, but I actually find that to be the least likely outcome.
Edwards getting the shot? I was going to say Colby Burns, because remember he called out Colby after the Maia win in March.
And you could definitely do that. But as of right now, I mean, I'm curious to get your answer on this. If you had to put money on Edwards versus Usman or Burns versus Usman, which is the more likely to actually happen next?
I mean, you're talking about a situation where there's a big X factor, right? The travel ban. If Fight Island is a real thing, I mean, and who knows who can fly to Fight Island? Are we considering that the whole world can get there, or just certain people?
Let's just assume people can get there.
Okay, I think they would go with Edwards first.
You do? Okay.
I mean, 8 in a row against 4 in a row. How do you justify it?
Our poor guy Edwards, man. Like, I know. He seems to get the short end of the stick. And like Burns, it's a good story, man. And like
it's a great story.
I'm not advocating for it. I mean, Edwards is more deserving, but they make the fights that are bigger, and it's a good storyline with teammates. And Burns is just the year that he's having. Sometimes, like I said, you catch lightning in a bottle. You knock out Damian Maia in Brazil. You come back. You dominate a former champion in the first fight back in Vegas. It just kind of feels like things are going in Gilbert Burns' way right now.
Yeah, 170 is fascinating. 155 is fascinating. Now we have a new name to consider at 170 pounds. So all in all, it was a great card. A lot of finishes. Cool to see, a major fight night card at the Apex. Of course, when the UFC built the Apex and opened it around a year and a half or so ago, they didn't expect this, but it's turned out to be a phenomenal move for them because now they can hold all these events there. And, from top to bottom, I mean, Billy Quarantillo, as he reminded us and wanted us all to know, Roosevelt Roberts, Mackenzie Dern, Caitlin Chukagian, Daniel Rodriguez, Brandon Royval, I mean, Casey Kenny, the first fight of the night, Chris Gutierrez. You can almost go through every single performance on this card and pick out someone and be like, that was the best performance outside of the main event. Is there a name or two that you want to spotlight?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that top to bottom, there were a lot of names to talk about. I will say the one that jumped out to me probably most was Roosevelt Roberts, just because the guy has a lot of potential. He just has a lot of intangibles, I think, with his frame, his speed, his well-rounded game. He's only 26 years old. He's got a little bit of swagger to him. He's got the confidence that is just hard to teach. It's just either you have it or you don't. He seems to really have it when he fights. He just looks comfortable in there. So he's young and he's been raw. So he's one of those guys that I've kind of always been looking for. Like, how has Roosevelt Roberts gotten better from fight to fight? And in this one, he checked all the boxes. I thought he was very, very good tonight. So to your point, a lot of good performances up and down the card. But if I had to pick one that stood out, it's probably Roosevelt Roberts.
I was really impressed with Chris Gutierrez in that first fight, the first fight of the night with those calf kicks. What a
Yeah.
great performance. The first round, 10-8, completely mauled the calf and of Vince Morales. And then in the second round, I mean, I thought Jason Herzog maybe went a little long, but in the end, I thought it was a good stoppage. So we were curious to see how Herzog would respond from the criticism after the Anthony Smith Glover Teixeira fight. Also was really impressed with Mackenzie Dern after her first pro loss back in October. She comes back 4 months after giving birth, and she looked to be in phenomenal shape. I was talking to her manager, Danny Rubenstein, who told me, like, by far, this was the best shape that she had ever been in. Remember, she had so much trouble making 115 in the past. And so, seems like maybe we jumped off the bandwagon a little too soon, or at least some people did. And I think she reminded us that she's still a player at 115. So, yeah, top to bottom was a lot of fun. Do you think, there's all these theories about the smaller cage, 25 feet versus 30 feet. This was the 25-foot cage, reminiscent of those Palms, Hard Rock nights, and of course the WEC cards from yesteryear. Do you think that the cage played a factor in the action tonight?
Yes, for sure. I mean, and it's hard to quantify, but you ask any fighter out there, I mean, some are going to say that they love it. Some are going to maybe act indifferent. But the fact is when you're removing that amount of square footage from an area, it's going to have an impact on the fight. And I want to hear what your opinion is in terms of whether you like it or not. Where I am on it is I like it, and I think that it's fan friendly, and I don't mind it. But I will say, I've seen that small cage. I know you have too, and I would prefer the title fights not take place in them. And I don't know. I can't even tell you why. Like, maybe it's just a personal thing. Maybe I don't like change. Maybe I'm just like a purist at heart, and that's what I'm just used to. But there's something about that cage is significantly smaller, and you can see it, you can feel it. And when we're talking about the absolute best fighters in the world, and we're determining who is the number one guy in the weight class on that night, I want nothing but the skill to say it, and in smaller fight areas, it can lead to a little bit more variability. It can lead to more kind of brawling, and not saying that any of these fights just turn into brawls because of a smaller cage, but it puts those guys in front of each other constantly, and in those elite fights, I wouldn't mind giving them the extra room.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. For these fight nights, I don't mind, of course, this main event could maybe be a number one contender fight if things work out for Gilbert Burns. But I agree with what you're saying. The main thing that I would like to see is, all right, if we're sticking with the 25-foot cage, as long as they're doing these events at the Apex for the foreseeable future, I want all the fighters to be aware of this, because to your point, like, you need to prepare for that, right? A lot of them aren't training in 25-foot cages, and maybe you could do things differently. Maybe you can, block out the cage a little bit differently, so you understand that there's only X amount of room to maneuver while you're in there. But I talked to a couple fighters who didn't even know until it came out this week. I forget who was the first reporter. I think it was John Morgan who first reported it, of MMA Junkie. They should know that, right? I mean, I feel like that should be in the contract or the bout agreement. So that's the one thing. I hope that Felicia Spencer and Amanda Nunes, if it's going to be the 25-foot cage next week, I hope that they knew this while they were preparing for the fight.
I can't believe that happens. Like, these guys and their representatives, that didn't come up to your mind like before this week. I mean, it just boggles my mind that athletes would even allow that to happen. I mean, that's they're in this sport. That's something you and I think about. Why aren't they thinking about that? Why aren't the representation thinking about that? So, but you're right. Of course, it should be in the bout agreement. It should be told them, concretely, that, hey, I'm going to accept this fight on this date, and this is the area of the cage that I'm fighting in. I mean, they need to know that.
If I'm a fan, I'm voting for it all day long. Clearly, it produces fun fights. Now, two more things before we go. Number one, you weren't in attendance, but you know that Apex arena very well. Obviously, it looked a little different this time, and it certainly looked a lot different than the events in Jacksonville, as I alluded to at the beginning. In terms of how the broadcasters were sitting, they had the plexiglass in front of them. Everyone was wearing a mask. It just seemed a lot stricter. I believe Dana White wasn't in the actual arena. He was in the back. He said that, he was going to wear a mask, so he chose to stay in the back. I mean, it seemed like Nevada really was being very strict about their rules and regulations. Florida, maybe less so. And After speaking to fighters at the hotel all week, they couldn't leave. They couldn't leave after the weigh-ins. They always had to have their mask on, et cetera, et cetera. What did you make of the difference between the way this event looked and was run as opposed to the 3 events in Jacksonville?
I mean, I feel a lot better about the one here, and that's just it's just the reality that we're in, you know. And I mean, I thought that the events in Jacksonville were fine. I thought that you know the UFC obviously was aggressive in being the first sports organization back, and they set a lot of things in place that they thought were necessary. You are correct in your description of Florida was kind of more like the UFC was telling them what was happening, and they were like, "Okay, that sounds good to us," or "Okay, well, maybe." But whereas Nevada is very hands on. Nevada for years, they heard the criticisms, they heard the kangaroo court stuff, and I think that they took that to heart, and they really want to make sure that they are all buttoned up. I mean, that's been sort of the thing about Nevada for a while now. I mean, you look back on even some of the way that they've run their meetings, before this pandemic, they really want to be buttoned up. They don't want there to be loopholes. They don't want themselves to fall under a real harsh state of criticism, which was happening for a bunch of years because they were making some funky decisions. So they're very hands-on, and it might seem a little bit over the top, some of the things that I heard this week, but I think it's necessary because we all want sports back and we want sports to stay back. And so I think that they're taking extreme measures, and this is an extreme time. So I think it was an improvement here in Nevada from what it was in Florida.
Yeah, erring on the side of caution in this regard seems like the right way to go about things. It's amazing. Like they had to rent out their own hotel, and each fighter had their own workout room. It's amazing to see the lengths that they're going to put on these events, but everyone walks away from them pretty much glowing, saying, yeah, they did it all the right way. They felt safe. They felt healthy. So here's another one. Technically, I guess you could say the fifth in the midst of the pandemic, but I kind of separate the Brazil one because that one happened so quickly, when everything shut down. So I separate that one from the 3 in Jacksonville. And this one, they return next week for UFC 250. That's going to be on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. That's the Felicia Spencer versus Amanda Nunes title fight. Honestly, I've called it a thin card on paper. Others have as well. It is a very sneaky good card, though. Like the names on this card outside of the main event, I'll tell you what my favorite is after I ask you. But you got Cody Garbrandt and Rafael Sunsound. You've got Sugar Sean O'Malley returning. And of course, Aljamain Sterling versus Corey Sandhagen. Anytime you get to see Nunes fight is a treat. Felicia Spencer, I think, is very game and should not be slept on. I like this card. I'm not trying to shill for the card. It's a fun card on paper. Now, is it worth $65? That's up to you, but it's a sneaky good card on paper. It's a hardcore fans card. Which fight in particular are you most looking forward to? And you could even include the main event if you want.
I think from a standpoint of just matchup wise, I love Aljamain Sterling versus Corey Sandhagen. I think that if you pulled most of to your point, the hardcore fans, because you're right, I look at this as the same way. It's kind of a hardcore fan card. I think most of them would say that probably just matchup on paper, stylistically, that is the most intriguing fight. But I think as far as storylines go, to me it is Cody Garbrandt. It is because I look back to prior to him losing his belt to TJ Dillashaw, and it really doesn't feel that long ago. And I can remember that this guy was on the cusp of stardom, real superstardom, I thought, at a division that has not really produced a lot of stars. 135 pounds. We're not talking about that division as that's the division where all the stars come from, and Cody Garbrandt had the it factor. He had the look, he had the fighting style, he had the knockouts, and then to lose twice to his former teammate, who was then, later in his career found to be using EPO, to go through some of the injuries that he's had, and now he's trying to switch camps and go to Mark Henry, but he still has, he still has an allegiance with Team Alpha Male, and he calls that home. But I think he recognized that he needed the new head coach, and I just find it fascinating. One time I was talking to him, he said, fans just don't realize it's like if a quarterback were to split ways with his offensive coordinator, like it takes years sometimes to get that back together. And that's what he had with Justin Buchholz at Team Alpha Male. He had a head coach that he really trusted in Justin Buchholz. Justin and the rest of the team weren't getting along, and he and Uriah had a little bit of a rift. So Justin left, and that was his head coach. And he really hasn't had a real traditional style head coach until now, Mark Henry. So I think that Cody Garbrandt is still very young, but he's taken some damage. and I'm very curious to see if he can return, to the level that he was before he lost those 2 fights to DJ.
Yeah, great story. I agree with your point on Sterling Sanhagen. I'm enamored with that fight. I can't wait to see it. I'm very high on Corey Sanhagen. I think he's a future title contender. Sterling's been around. He's looked really good. I'm curious to see how he looks after coming back from the wrist surgery. And I really do believe I'm not bold enough to call an upset, but I really believe Felicia Spencer is going to give Amanda Nunes a tough fight after what she did against Chris Cyborg in Edmonton last summer. She is not afraid. She is fearless, and she has nothing to lose in this regard. And Amanda has everything to lose, right? She's the GOAT and all this stuff. So I'm really curious to see how that fight
I think you should do
plays
it.
out.
I think you, Ariel Helwani, never makes predictions.
Yeah.
I think this is the
Just
one you
do
should
it.
hang your hat on.
Because no one
This
will
is the one
remember
you
if
should
I
go
get it
for.
wrong, and everyone will remember if I get it right. But they'll also say I'm a homer because she's from Montreal, and so they'll say that's the only reason why I'm picking her. But I really do believe I'm really impressed with Felicia. New York Rick has been telling me that Felicia Spencer was going to be a champion long before she entered the UFC, when she just came to Invicta. So I'll pin it on him. All right. He's the one that called it. Now, we appreciate you all watching. Fun night. I'd be remiss if I don't mention that I think we all watched the events with heavy hearts with what's going on around the world. I've seen the footage of what's going on in Las Vegas, where you live, what's going on here in the East Coast. It's a crazy time. Sports are often an escape valve for all of us. I think I was kind of watching with, half my brain on the actual real news and half my brain on the fights. But I hope you were able to all watch the fights for 5-6 hours or so, forget about what's going on. And we're back to reality now. But we appreciate everyone watching. And we just hope that everyone out there is safe and, taking care of each other, because these are crazy times. And we just want everything to get better and go back to normal. So thank you so much to everyone for watching. We appreciate you as always. And we got a lot of coverage coming your way regarding UFC 250. Again, that's this coming Saturday. Now, I guess 6 days from now, June 6th, back in Las Vegas on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. For Brett, I'm Ariel. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next week.